The Sigma 16mm has long been the gold standard as an affordable wide-angle lens option for crop sensor cameras. And in a number of different lens mounts, this was the only option. But in recent years, things have changed, and both Viltrox and Sirui have released similar lenses, which have a number of advantages over the Sigma. They are also significantly cheaper. So I've done a deep dive comparison covering the important optical tests as well as the autofocus performance to really help you make up your own mind which of these lenses might be best for you. I'll put some links in the description down below to the best pricing I could find on these lenses, as well as any discount codes I know about. And if you're curious about what I use to produce my videos now, including my main camera, lens, and audio setup, I'll put a link to all those details in the description down below as well. In full disclosure, Sirui and Viltrox did send these lenses out to me at no cost to myself, but none of these companies ever had any say in the making of my videos. They've never flown me to an exotic destination, and they've never paid me any money. Before I jump into the test, given that the focal length and aperture is very similar across the different lenses, I just want to talk about what these lenses might be good for and whether this is even the right focal length for you. The Sigma 16mm is a particularly popular YouTube lens and vlogging lens. And because of that, if you're watching YouTube videos, it is getting a disproportionate amount of coverage on YouTube or social media. And because of that, I think a lot of people are buying into this focal length and not realizing that this is not the right focal length for the type of photos or videos that they want to capture. And a lot of that comes from the fact that it gives you a decent environment around you. It can show a person in an environment and show the surrounding environment. But it's not so wide that it creates some crazy distortion on their face. I will also mention that 16mm, you really do have to have a long arm or hold it a little bit further away. Once we get down to the Viltrox at 15mm, I think that's a little bit better of a vlogging lens just because of the extra width. But 16mm is very popular on YouTube, very popular for vlogging and content creation. Also, given the large maximum aperture across all the lenses, they're going to be excellent in low light conditions. That's going to be one big advantage over your kit or zoom lens, which might have that 16mm focal length. Once you get in low light conditions, that lens isn't going to perform very well, where these are going to allow a lot more light in, so you're going to get a much cleaner image. You're also going to be able to get a deeply out of focus area, which is very popular for YouTube and talking head videos like this. The other thing that this focal length is going to be good for is landscape and architecture. That's because it's going to get you a nice wide scene inside a building, historic church, inside a city. It's going to get you a nice wraparound environment, but it's not so wide that it's going to look crazy or distorted or unnatural. So it is a very neutral wide focal length for that sort of photo or that sort of video. And because of that, these are also going to be great lenses for street photography and travel. It's a little bit wider than the standard street lens, but it is a great all-purpose travel lens. Once again, it's going to perform well in low light conditions. So if you're in a city at night or if you're in a dark building, this is going to work very, very well for you. And it also has a very neutral standard wide angle field of view. The other thing that these are all going to be quite good for is astrophotography or astro time lapse, whether you want to get the streaking of the stars, you want to create a time lapse of the stars going by or the aurora borealis or what have you. These are all going to do that reasonably well. Once again, because they're very wide, capture a lot of the environment, a big part of the sky, but they also have a large maximum aperture, which is going to allow a lot of light in, which is going to give you nice clean photos or time lapse when you're shooting the stars. And just looking at the three lenses next to each other, you're going to see there is a big difference between size, weight, and build. And just starting with the Sigma, you're going to find that it is a standard, extremely well-built Sigma lens. It's a combination of metal and Sigma's special composite material, which kind of feels like metal, and it is an exceptionally well-built lens. You get a very nice polished metal lens mount. You get this nice big deep lens hood. You've got this big rubber focus ring, and overall it just has an excellent build to it. Next, we're going to have a look at the Viltrox, and this lens is at the other end of the spectrum. Now, I don't want you to think this lens feels cheap by any means, but it is an all plastic body. It does have a polished metal lens mount, and it does have a USB-C port for updating the firmware, but it is a significantly smaller lens. It's also significantly lighter. It's also significantly less expensive. This is a much better, more portable lens. So if size is a factor, then I think this lens probably stands out for that reason. It doesn't have quite as deep a lens hood as the Sigma, so it's probably not going to be as useful at knocking down flare, but it is still a nice lens. And if I were to say, how does this lens feel built? I would say it feels built similar to a high quality kit lens or a nifty 50 by any of the manufacturers. It isn't cheap or junk by any means, but it certainly doesn't feel premium either. Now, just having a look at the Sirui, it actually has a build which feels quite similar to the Sigma. It's slightly lighter, it is slightly smaller, and it really does have quite a cool look to it. Now, this is going to be personal preference. You got this blue ring. You do have a nice textured or knurled focus ring here. And there's a couple of different versions. There's a white version, it looks like white ceramic, and then there's this version that has like the carbon fiber on it. It is quite a nice looking lens. Once again, all personal preference, but this definitely feels like a very premium, well-built lens. Now, just jumping into the optical tests, I've got a lot to get through, but make sure you stay to the end because that's where the all-important autofocus performance comes in. And I think it's a real surprise. I was very surprised, and I think you will be too. Now, just looking at the distortion performance, the Viltrox has very strong mustache distortion. You're either going to have to correct that in editing or in camera, and it's going to be quite obvious if you have straight lines close to the edge of frame and you don't correct it. The Sirui has the most modest amount of mustache distortion, but I think it is very good, and you could leave that uncorrected in most situations and you wouldn't even notice it. And the Sigma has a moderate amount of barrel distortion, which once again you can correct in camera or in editing, and it is quite easy to correct. Now, looking at chromatic aberration and shooting them all wide open, the Sigma and the Sirui have noticeable chromatic aberration in high contrast backlit scenes where the Viltrox has little to none. But note, I have shot all of these wide open at their maximum apertures, which isn't really a fair comparison because we got an f1.2 and an f1.4 versus an f1.7. As you stop them down, the chromatic aberration goes away, and I don't think it is a major issue in most real-world results. But if you shoot the Sigma or the Sirui wide open with some backlit trees or something like that, you are going to get some purple fringing in your images. Looking at flare performance, they are all pretty good, but the Sigma and the Viltrox are clearly the best, with the Sirui just a little bit behind. Now, I think this is going to be personal preference, and some people like flares and some people don't like flares, and I don't think any of them have a bad performance, which would make me choose one over the other based on flare. But if we're just looking at a clinical flare test, the Sigma and the Viltrox perform best, and I found they were very similar to each other. Just looking at the sharpness of the lenses and starting wide open with the Viltrox at f1.7, the Sigma at f1.4, and the Sirui at f1.2, it's actually very hard to pick them apart. They are all very, very similar, which to me is an extremely impressive performance for the Sirui because it's going all the way to f1.2. So to be able to get f1.2 and really be on par with the others as far as center sharpness is extremely impressive. Once we stop it down to f2, it is very, very close. Maybe the Sigma's the sharpest, followed by the Sirui, with the Viltrox just a little bit behind. But once again, these are so close, I don't think you would pick them apart in real-world results. Stopping down to f2.8, they are still very close. Maybe the Sigma just a little bit, and then the Sirui and the Viltrox about the same. And once you stop it down to f4, they are so close. Maybe the Sigma has a slight edge, but the Sirui and the Viltrox about the same. But overall, the center sharpness across all of the different apertures is so close that I don't think you would pick it apart in real-world results. Looking at the sharpness at the edge of frame, which I think in general is more important than the corner frame, because you're rarely going to put something that is a focal point of an image in the corner frame, but it's not uncommon if you've got a row of people lined up for a photo that you're going to have somebody on the edge of frame. And shooting them all wide open at their maximum aperture, the sharpness of the Sigma seemed to be the best, the Sirui was next, and the Viltrox wasn't too far behind. At f2.8, the Sigma and the Sirui are very, very close, with the Viltrox a little bit behind. And stopping down to f4, they are all very close, and it's very hard to pick them apart. And I think in real-world results, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And this is important because if you are shooting a group photo, and maybe you have a couple rows of people, you're probably going to be shooting it at f4 anyways. So in real-world results, I think the edge sharpness is going to be very similar across all of the lenses. Looking at the corner sharpness, wide open, they are all very similar, which kind of surprised me. I thought we would see a bigger difference here. Once we stop them down to f2, they're all very similar. Maybe the Sigma is the best, and at f2.8, it is very close. Maybe the Sigma and then the Sirui, but once again, it's very, very close. And at f4, I think they are basically identical to each other. Now, looking at the bokeh and background blur, I think they were all very good. There were no distracting elements. I didn't find any crazy patterns in the autofocus specular highlights or bokeh balls. I think this is going to be very much personal preference. And I went back and forth, and at different times, I preferred the Sigma, and then other times I preferred the Viltrox, and other times I preferred the Sirui. So across all of them, it was very, very similar. Now, one thing you will notice this is because the Sirui is f1.2. You are going to be able to get more deeply out of focus areas. It's going to be easier to isolate a subject in a scene and get them to pop off of that image. It's also going to give you a little bit better low light performance, followed by the Sigma, which is an f1.4. And then looking at the Viltrox, not only is it an f1.7 lens, it's also a 15mm. So you're not going to get as deeply out of focus areas because it's an f1.7, but also because it's a 15mm. So you do have less of an ability to isolate a subject with that lens particularly. Looking at close-up image quality, I thought they were all reasonably good. The Sigma has a minimum focus distance of 25 centimeters, the Sirui has 30 centimeters, and the Viltrox has 23 centimeters. And the Sigma, I think, really gave a highly detailed close focus image, and I probably would say it maybe was the best, but the Viltrox was no slouch either. The Sirui at 30 centimeters, you had to be a little bit further back, and I don't think the image was quite as clean, but it's certainly not a performance difference between any of them that I would necessarily pick one over the other. Looking at Vignette, they all have significant Vignette wide open, with the Viltrox possibly being the strongest. Once you stop it down to f2, the Viltrox still has strong Vignette, where the other two clean up pretty significantly. And at f2.8, the Sigma and the Sirui are exceptionally clean, with the Viltrox still showing noticeable Vignette. Even as we stop it down through the range, the Viltrox maintains its reasonably heavy Vignette, where the Sigma and the Sirui are almost perfectly clean all the way down to f11. Testing the autofocus performance and starting with the Sigma and using the animal mode, I think the camera did reasonably well. Once the box was around the animal, it really did seem to keep up, particularly as it got closer to the camera, and it did hold focus pretty well. Looking at the Viltrox, I think it did probably just as well. I didn't see any meaningful difference between the two. Maybe when the animal got really close to the camera, it couldn't quite keep up. But for the most part, it locked on, and I really didn't notice a significant difference between the two. And then coming to the Sirui, having an f1.2 lens and having bigger lens elements made me think it might struggle, but I didn't think that there was any difference or any meaningful difference between the three lenses in the animal mode. I thought they all performed very similarly. Switching into the human detection mode and just walking at the camera, the box was on me and the lens locked on, and when I moved out of frame, it then focused on the background, which is what we would expect. We did get a little pulse there for a second. The Sigma is very, very quick, which can sometimes result in what looks like a pulse because it's locking on or changing so quickly. The Sigma performed the best in the running test, where it got more frames in focus as the subject approached the camera. The closer the subject gets to the camera, the faster the lens needs to be to nail focus. Looking at the Viltrox really looks quite smooth and cinematic. I think the motors are a little bit slower, and so when I'm walking back and forth, it's definitely not losing me. And it does a nice cinematic focus pull to the background, which I really, really liked. These are just default camera settings. Now here we're just jumping back and forth, so it's just focusing on each of our faces. And it doesn't really lose us or pulse at all. It just locks on when the next person comes in frame, and I think that worked well. I did find with subjects running at the camera, it didn't work quite as well, and I think that's just because the focus motors were a little bit slower than what the Sigma are. Looking at the Sirui's performance and just walking back and forth, what you'll see, it has no problem. It's locked on to me. I'm not seeing any pulsing or hunting. The focus pulls seem reasonably smooth and natural, and I really don't have any problem with this performance. So if you're vlogging or anything like that, I think it's going to work quite well. You are going to notice that focus pulls are a little bit slower and kind of look cinematic, but there might be subjects that they just can't keep up with. With the jumping in and out of frame, it worked quite well, but it was a little bit of a slower performance than the other two. And in the running test, the Sirui is a little bit slower and, as I expected, struggled to keep up with a running subject. Looking at the photo autofocus performance with a subject running at the camera in human detection mode, the Sigma works very well. Now, the closer the subject gets to the camera, the harder it is. But even when she flipped her hair to the side or head to the side, it really locked on. And it really only missed this last 1 or 2 frames in the shot. Looking at the Viltrox, I wasn't sure how well it would perform, but it performed better than I expected, and it didn't perform quite as well as the Sigma, but it wasn't that far behind, and it probably only missed the last 2 or 3 frames of the photo series. Now, looking at the Sirui, it was a little bit slower in video, and once again, we're going to see the same thing in photo, and as she approaches the camera, I would say the last 5 or 6 frames, or almost half of the photos, are completely out of focus. The autofocus motors just aren't fast enough. And to draw some conclusions on those autofocus tests, in my real world shooting, I could not tell them apart. They all worked equally well as each other. I never really am using a 16mm lens to have someone run at the camera. And those are the only situations where we actually were able to expose the little bit slower autofocus modes in the other two lenses. For vlogging, general purpose photography, walking around, family photos, and almost every other real world example of capturing photos or videos that I could think of, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between any of them. So unless you really need some ultra fast autofocus speed for quick moving subjects, then I think in practical terms, they will all work perfectly fine. Deep research videos like this are only made possible by people using the affiliate links in the description of this video. Without those affiliate links and people using them, I cannot make videos like this. YouTube simply doesn't pay enough to make that work. So if this video was helpful, check out those affiliate links. And if the pricing is the best, which I try to do my research, then please use those links and it will make a big difference. And I'll be able to continue to make videos like this one. Ultimately, I think all of these lenses performed excellently, particularly for their different price points. First, I want to talk about the Viltrox. It is the cheapest, it's the smallest, it's the lightest, and it's also exceptionally sharp. Now, when we shot it on the test chart, there were some situations where we could pick that the other lenses might have been a little bit sharper. But in real world results, I think you will struggle to tell the difference between the sharpness in this lens and either of the other two. And it has the significant advantage of being so small and light, plus a fraction of the price of the other ones. So if you're on a budget or you want a smaller, lighter lens, I would not hesitate to go for the Viltrox. Looking at the Sirui, I think that was probably the biggest surprise of all the lenses in this comparison for me because it is an f1.2 lens. It's very sharp at f1.2. It's going to give you the best low light. It's going to give you the deepest out of focus areas. And it is a similar size and weight to the Sigma. It's actually just slightly lighter. And it is much cheaper than the Sigma. In addition to that, the autofocus performance held up really well, particularly for a lens that goes to f1.2. So I do think if you want the best low light, deepest out of focus areas, and you're looking for a blurry background lens, particularly for YouTube, where a lot of people want to isolate their subject, want to have it so the background is blurry, at a fraction of the price of the Sigma, you really can't go wrong with the Sirui. And that leaves us with the Sigma, which after all these years performs really, really well. Now, probably the biggest disadvantage to me to the Sigma is the price, but keep in mind you are buying into a company that has a long history. You know the warranty is going to be there. You know replacement parts are going to be there. You know that you're going to be able to get good service from Sigma. They are an established brand. I would say that the autofocus performance, if I had to bet my life on autofocus performance, I would still pick the Sigma over the other two, even though the performance results were a little bit inconclusive. I think Sigma does have the runs on the board as far as autofocus performance goes. And certainly if you already have the Sigma, I don't think either of these two lenses represent an upgrade unless you want something a bit smaller and lighter. So I really don't think you can go wrong with any of these lenses. Now, if you want to improve the quality of your photos and videos without spending a dime on a new lens, I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is the best tutorial that I have ever done on photography and image composition. And I'd be very surprised if you watch that video to the end and you aren't a better photographer at the end of that video than you are right now.